All right, guys, so we're on chapter 4 of The Art of the Deal, Trump. Chapter 4, The Cincinnati Kid, Prudence Pays. In college, while my friends were reading the comics and the sports pages of newspapers, I was reading the listings of FHA foreclosures. It might seem a bit abnormal to study lists of federally financed housing projects in foreclosure, but that's what I did. So federal housing foreclosures. It might seem a bit abnormal to study lists of federally financed housing projects in foreclosure, but that's what I did. And that's how I found out about Swifton Village. It was a job that I bought with my father while I was in college, and it was my first big deal. Dang, bought something with his dad. Honestly, probably with his dad's money, maybe. Swifton Village was a 1,200 unit apartment development in Cincinnati, Ohio, and it was a very troubled place. There were 800 vacant apartments. The developers had gone under, the government had foreclosed, and the whole deal was a disaster. But from our perspective, that was great because it gave us a terrific opportunity. A lot of times when you are dealing with a government agency on a foreclosure, they just want to get out of it as quickly as possible. They aren't equipped to manage it. In this case, things had deteriorated so badly that no one else was even bidding. Today you'll find the same thing if you go out to the Sun Belt, where they built all that housing during the oil boom. Now you have huge developments with 30 and 40% vacancy rates. Developers are suicidal because banks are foreclosing on them. It's a great time for a smart buyer because you can get unbelievable deals. My father and I put in a very minimal bid for Swifton, and it was accepted. We ended up paying less than $6 million for a job which had cost twice that much to build just 2 years earlier. We were also immediately able to get a mortgage for what we paid, plus about $100,000, which we put toward fixing the place up. In other words, we got the project without putting down any money of our own. All we had to do was go and run it. And if we did even a halfway decent job, we could easily cover our mortgage from the proceeds of the rent. The fact that it was such a big job appealed to my father and to me because it meant we could focus a lot of energy on it without feeling we were wasting our time. It takes almost the same amount of energy to manage 50 units as it does 1,200, except that with 1,200, you have a much bigger upside. After we negotiated the deal, success became a matter of management and marketing. The challenge was to get the place rented and rented to good tenants who would stay there. The tenants who were living in the project when I took over had ripped the place apart. Many of them had come down from the hills of Kentucky. They were very poor and had 7 or 8 children, almost no possessions, and no experience living in an apartment complex. They crammed into 1 room and 2-room apartments, and their children went wild. They would just destroy the apartments and wreak havoc on the property. The tenants not only didn't care, many of them also didn't see fit to pay rent. If you pressed them, they had a tendency to take off. What we discovered is that to avoid paying rent, these people would rent a trailer, pull it up in front of their apartments at 1 or 2 in the morning and disappear into the night with all their belongings. That was fine by me, but I wanted to make sure we got paid first. Our solution was to institute a trailer watch. We had someone on round-the-clock patrol. After we got rid of the bad tenants, we set about fixing the place up to attract a better element. That required a substantial investment, almost $800,000 by the time we were done, which was a lot of money in those days, but it was more than worth it. In New York, the laws prevent you from getting fair increases even when you make improvements. In New York, the laws prevent you from getting fair increases even when you make improvements. But in Cincinnati, we were immediately able to charge and get much higher rents for the apartments at Swifton Village. So they were in Cincinnati. The first thing we did was invest in beautiful white shutters for the windows. That may not sound like a big deal, but what the shutters did was give a bunch of cold red brick buildings a feeling of warmth and coziness, which is important. Beautiful white shutters. It made it feel warmth and cozy. It was also much more expensive than you'd guess because you're talking about 1,200 units, each of which has 8 to 10 windows. The next thing we did was rip out the cheap, horrible aluminum front doors on the apartments and put up beautiful colonial white doors. So doors and windows. I made sure the whole complex was very clean and very well maintained. As I said earlier, I've always had a personal thing about cleanliness, but I also believe it's a very good investment. For example, if you want to sell a car and you spend $5 to wash and polish it and then apply a little extra elbow grease, suddenly you find you can charge an extra $400 and get it. I can always tell a loser when I see someone with a car for sale that is filthy dirty. It's so easy to make it look better. It's no different in real estate. Well-maintained real estate is always going to be worth a lot more than poorly maintained real estate. That's been less true during the past few years in New York, when there's been such a fever for real estate that people buy anything, but it's a mistake to be lulled by good times. Markets always change, and as soon as there's a downturn, cleanliness becomes a major value. We painted the hallways, we sanded and stained the floors, we kept the vacant apartments immaculately clean, and we landscaped the grounds. We also ran beautiful newspaper ads for the project at a time when not many people in Cincinnati were advertising real estate. People came to check us out, and the word of mouth started getting good. Within a year, the buildings were 100% rented. Along the way, we went through, advertising, real estate. Along the way, we went through a half dozen different project managers before we found the one we wanted. We had managers who were honest but dumb, including one guy who literally painted himself into the corner of an apartment. Others were smart but didn't know the first thing about managing. Fortunately, we went through them fast because I tend to size people up pretty quickly. Ultimately, we got a fabulous man whom I'll call Irving. Irving was 65 years old and a real character. He was one of the greatest bullshit artists I've ever met. But in addition to being a very sharp talker and a very slick salesman, he was also an amazing manager. Irving was the kind of guy who worked perhaps an hour a day and accomplished more in that hour than most managers did in 12 hours. I learned something from that. It's not how many hours you put in, it's what you get done while you're working. The problem with Irving was that he wasn't the most trustworthy guy in the world. I suspected as much from the first day, but it wasn't until I tried to put a bond on him, something I do with an employee who handles money, that my instincts were confirmed. My insurance agent called me back after running a check and he said, "Donald, you got to be kidding about a bond. This guy is a con man." It turned out that Irving had done all sorts of con jobs and swindles, and he'd often been in trouble with the law. My philosophy has always been that if you've ever catch someone stealing, you have to go after him very hard, even if it costs you 10 times more than he stole. Stealing is the worst, but with Irving I had a dilemma. He was far and away more capable than any honest manager I had found. That's funny. He was far and away more capable than any honest manager I had found, and so long as he was in charge, no one under him would dare steal. That meant I only had to keep my eye on him. I used to kid Irving. I'd say, "We pay you $50,000 and all you can steal," and he would act all upset. "We pay you $50,000 and all you can steal." If I caught him in the act, I would have fired Irving on the spot, but I never did. Still, I figure he managed to steal at least another $50,000 a year. Even so, I was probably getting a bargain. One day I walked into the office and one of the girls who worked there was crying. It turned out that there was something they called a funeral fund, to which they all contributed in order to buy flowers for anyone they knew who died. They had about 80 in the fund. When I asked the girl what she was crying about, she said, "Oh, that Irving, he stole our funeral fund." This is funny. One day I walked into the office and one of the girls who worked there was crying. It turned out that there was something they called a funeral fund, to which they all contributed in order to buy flowers for anyone who knew they knew who died. They had about $80 in the fund. When I asked the girl, I went to Irving and I said, "Irving, damn it, did you steal their money?" Of course, he just denied it. He swore he'd get those girls, and then he ran it and raved for half an hour, but I always assumed the girls were telling the truth. Irving was a classic. He had problems, but he was a classic. I love these stories. I'll give you an example of how Irving worked. You've got to understand that we are talking about a short, fat, bald-headed guy with thick glasses and hands like jello, who never lifted anything in his life beside a pen and who had no physical ability whatsoever. What he did, however, was an incredible mouth. As I mentioned, in the early days, we had a good number of tenants who didn't believe in paying rent. Sometimes Irving would go out and collect himself. He'd ring the doorbell, and when someone came to the door, he'd go crazy. He'd get red in the face, use every filthy word he could think of, and make every threat in the book. It was an act, but it was very effective. Usually they paid up right then and there. One day while Irving was on his rounds, he knocked on the door and a little 10-year-old girl answered. Irving said, "You go tell your father to pay his fucking rent or I'm going to knock his ass off." As he went on like that until the girl's mother came out to see what was going on. As it happened, she was an absolutely beautiful woman. As he went on like that until the girl's mother came out to see what was going on. As it happened, she was an absolutely beautiful woman. Now, Irving had a weakness for all women, and this woman was quite exceptional. So immediately, Irving started putting the move on her. He invited her out to dinner. Okay, now Irving had a weakness for all women, and this woman was quite exceptional. So immediately, Irving started putting the move on her. He invited her out to dinner, or he invited her out to dinner. The woman, whose husband was either a truck driver or a construction worker, had never experienced anyone like Irving, and obviously didn't know what to do, or didn't know what to make of him. There was no way, however, that she was interested in Irving, and finally he gave up and we left. About an hour later, Irving and I were sitting in his office when this huge guy, a monster, maybe 240 pounds, burst through the door. He was furious that Irving had cursed in front of his daughter, and he was ready to strangle him for coming on to his wife. The guy had murder in his eyes. I expected Irving, if he had any sense, to run for his life. Instead, he started verbally attacking the man, flailing and screaming and chopping his hands in the air. "You get out of this office," he said. "I'll kill you. I'll destroy you. These hands are lethal weapons. They're registered with the police department." I'll never forget how the guy looked at Irving and said, "You come outside, you fat crap. I want to burn grass with you." I always loved that phrase, burn grass, and I thought to myself, Irving is in serious trouble. But Irving didn't seem to think so. "I'd fight you anytime you want," he said, "but it's unlawful for me to fight." All you had to do was look at Irving to know those hands were hardly registered weapons, but Irving was very much like a lion tamer. You've seen these guys, maybe 150 pounds, who walk blithely into a cage where there's a magnificent 800-pound lion pacing around. If the animal sensed any weakness or any fear, he destroyed the trainer in a second, but instead the trainer cracks his whip, walks with authority, and amazingly the lion listens. Which is exactly what Irving did with this huge guy, except his whip was his mouth. The result was that the guy left the office. He was still enraged, but he left. Irving probably saved his own life just by showing no fear, and that left a very vivid impression on me. You can't be scared. You do your thing, you hold your ground, you stand up tall, and whatever happens, happens. As for Swifton Village, once Irving had it running well, I began spending less and less time there. I wasn't really needed anymore in Cincinnati, so I cut back my visits to Swifton, first to once a week and eventually to once a month. Early on, I'd become particularly friendly with one of the newer tenants at Swifton. He was Jewish, an older man who'd been in a concentration camp in Poland. He started off in America as a butcher, then bought the shop, and by the time I met him, he owned perhaps 14 butcher shops. He and his wife had taken 2 apartments in Swifton and put them together, and they had a great place, and they were very happy there. I had a lot of respect for this guy because he had street smarts. He'd been around, and he was obviously a true survivor. One day, a number of years after we first bought the place, I was out visiting. I ran into my friend. "How are you doing? How are you feeling?" I asked. "Good, good," he replied, but then he took me aside and whispered, "Donald, you are a friend of mine, and I have to tell you, sell this job." And I said, "Why?" "Because it's going real bad. Not the job, but the area is being surrounded by people who are so bad they will cut your throat and walk away and not even think about it. I'm talking about people who enjoy cutting throats." That was the exact expression. I never forgot it. Now I'm someone who responds to people I have respect for, and I listen. Again, it's instincts, not marketing studies. So I spent an extra 2 days in Cincinnati, and I rode around, and I saw that there was trouble brewing. The neighborhoods were getting rough. I put the job up for sale, and almost immediately we got an offer. We'd already done very well with Swifton Village because our debt was very small relative to the size of the complex, and our rent roll by the end had reached about $700,000 a year, but selling was how we made a real killing. The buyer was the Prudent Real Estate Investment Trust. Those were the go-go days. Those were the go-go days when real estate investment trusts, partnerships that invested in real estate were very hot. Real estate investment trusts, partnerships that invested in real estate were very hot. The banks were loaning money to any REIT. The only problem, or real estate investment trust. The only problem was that many of the people running the real estate investment trust were neither knowledgeable nor competent. I called them the guys with the white bucks. They were the sort of people who throw money into a project in Puerto Rico without even going to see it. Eventually they discovered that the building they thought they'd bought had never even been built. In the case of Prudent, they sent a young man out to inspect and evaluate the property prior to making a final decision on whether to go forward with the sale. This kid was about my age, but he looked like a teenager. Frankly, I was surprised they entrusted such a big decision to him. It turned out that what he wanted to do more than anything was to go out for lunch. He heard about this restaurant in downtown Cincinnati called the Masonette, which is supposed to be one of the 5 best restaurants in the country. He really wanted to eat there, and when he called to say he was coming, he asked me to make a lunch reservation. I said fine. His flight came in a little late, about midday, and I met him and I took him over to Swifton Village and showed him the job. We still had 100% occupancy at the time, and he wasn't interested in asking a lot of questions beyond that. He was anxious to get to the Masonette. It took about a half an hour to get there from Swifton, and we ended up spending about 3 hours over lunch, which is the opposite of the way I normally work. If I had only one day to look over a big job like Swifton, I sure as hell skipped lunch and spent my time learning everything I could about what I was thinking of buying. By the time we were done with lunch, it was almost 4 o'clock. Let me see. It took about half an hour to get there. We ended up spending about 3 hours over lunch, which is the opposite of the way I like to work. If I had only one day to look over a big job like Swifton, I sure as hell skipped lunch and spent my time learning everything I could about what I was thinking of buying. By the time we were done with lunch, it was almost 4 o'clock, and I had to take him to his plane. He returned to New York well fed and feeling great, and he strongly recommended going ahead with the purchase. He told his bosses that the area was wonderful and that Swifton was a great deal. They approved the sale. The price was $12 million. I think they bought it for $6 or $3 million. The price was $12 million, or approximately $6 million profit for us. It was a huge return on a short-term investment. What happened next is that we signed a contract. By then I could see the dark clouds clearly on the horizon. A lot of tenants had their leases coming up and weren't planning to renew. We put a clause in the contract of sale saying that all representations contained in it were as of the signing of the contract, not as of the closing, which is what's typically required. A lot of tenants had their leases coming up and weren't planning to renew. We put a clause in the contract of sale saying that all representations contained in it were as of the signing of the contract, not as of the closing, which is typically required. In other words, we were willing to represent that the project was 100% rented at the time of the contract signing, but we didn't want to make the same promise at the time of closing, 3 or 4 months down the line. The other thing I did was to insist, let me highlight that. We put a clause in the contract of sale saying that all representations contained in it were as of the signing of the contract, not as of closing, which is what's typically required. In other words, we were willing to represent that the project was 100% rented at the time of the contract signing, but we didn't want to make the same promise at the time of closing 3 or 4 months down the line. The other thing I did was to insist on a clause in the contract in which they guaranteed they'd close or else pay a huge penalty. That was also very unusual because in nearly every other deal, the buyer puts up 100. The other thing I did was to insist on a clause in the contract in which they guaranteed they'd close their lease, or else pay a huge penalty. That was also very unusual because in nearly every other deal, the buyer puts up a 10% deposit. And if he fails to close, all he forfeits is the deposit. Frankly, the prudent people should have been more prudent. But as I said, the REITs, the real estate investment trusts, were hot to trot, and they couldn't make deals fast enough. In the end, of course, it never pays to be in too much of a hurry. On the day we closed, there were dozens of vacant apartments. Frankly, the prudent people should have been more prudent. But as I said, the real estate investment trusts were hot to trot, and they couldn't make deals fast enough. In the end, of course, it never pays to be in too much of a hurry. I mean, they were just rushing. They're stupid, pretty much. They were getting swindled. They were letting that manager, they were letting that fucking manager, what's his name? The crazy ass manager guy? Irving. They were letting a guy like Irving be the decision maker, pretty much. It's crazy. Someone like Irving, a big part of this real estate shit is making sure they pay their rent. Think about that. I mean, he even spoke about his dad. He said when his dad was doing the low to middle class income housing, he didn't really like it because having to deal with trying to collect your rent. These fucking people are shady, man. People don't fucking pay their rent, you know? Shit. That's my folks. Peace.